In an earlier vid, I briefly discussed some data concerning the transmission of the text of the New Testament. In that light, it's a good time to launch a series on the subject, and we'll start with what to some of you may be old news, but it's still necessary to lay the groundwork for what follows. It's fair to say that one of the leading and most solid Christian apologetics arguments has to do with the embarrassment of riches we have when it comes to the text of the New Testament. Let's explain why. The process and science of what is called textual criticism is what we use to determine what a text originally said when it was written. In the case of documents from the ancient world, we of course have few or no original documents from authors like Tacitus or Josephus, nothing that was personally penned by them. That means we inevitably rely on copies of their works to figure out what they said. In that case, as you might expect, the source for our data is always copies of their works, or what's called manuscripts. And as with just about anything, more is generally better. The more copies we have, the bigger the data pool is for us to conduct textual criticism. But when it comes to textual criticism, not just more is better, so is earlier. In general, if we have manuscripts that come from a time closer to the time when they were written, then we consider ourselves to have better quality data with which to conduct textual criticism. That's because time is an obvious opportunity for degradation to happen in the textual tradition, for scribes to make mistakes or for changes to be made. So in sum, the more and the earlier, in general, the better. With that stage set, it's time to recite for the record some of the basic comparative information which forms the core of a textual reliability apologetic. What I'll give you here is approximate numbers for data that I last checked on a couple of years ago, which means it may be slightly out of date. And if you saw that prior vid, yes, this is some of the same stuff we looked at there. Now, as I said in the prior vid, with this much data available for the New Testament, critics are compelled to take a sort of gloom, despair, and agony on me approach. And in our next entry in this series, we'll have a look at some of those gloomy arguments. But before I close, one final thing I ought to point out before some funny atheist starts whining about it. I found that a lot of critics assume that when we argue for the reliability of the textual transmission of the New Testament, we're thereby arguing for the historical reliability of the New Testament. Well, I've never argued that, and personally I've never seen anyone that does. But I've seen a lot of fundy atheists confuse one argument with the other. So, from here on in this series, fundy atheist, make sure you don't do that, okay? See you next time.